Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Our subject this evening is the objectivist answer to certain selected problems that arose in the history of philosophy in the period from Greece through David Hume. And I must at the outset delimit our assignment. Objectivism denies that any philosophic question can be answered in a vacuum. It holds that all philosophic problems and issues are interconnected, and therefore that a full answer to any one philosophical question would require the presentation of a full system of philosophy. Now, such a presentation of the objectivist philosophy is obviously impossible this evening. Throughout my presentation tonight, therefore, I am counting on a considerable knowledge on your part of the philosophy of objectivism. I'm assuming that you're generally familiar with the objectivist literature, particularly with Ayn Rand's introduction to objectivist epistemology, with its presentation of the objectivist theory of concept formation, and that you're familiar with Galt's speech with its overview and summary of the objectivist philosophy. And I'm assuming that you understand in particular the objectivist views we have already covered or mentioned in this course. Above all, the three fundamental axioms of objectivism. Existence exists, what we have been calling the primacy of existence. The axiom that one exists possessing consciousness, consciousness being the faculty of perceiving that which exists, and A is A, the law of identity, along with its reformulations, the law of contradiction and the law of excluded middle. I'm counting also on your knowledge of the fallacy of the stolen concept, the fallacy of using a concept while denying or ignoring a more basic concept on which it depends. In general, I'm assuming an overall knowledge of objectivism in order to concentrate on three basic issues. First, the senses, and all the tangled questions we have postponed now for weeks until this evening. Then, a discussion of the borderline case problem that arises in the theory of universals. And finally, a brief discussion of the problem of certainty and of what is wrong with the method of Cartesian doubt. All right, let us turn to the first issue to which we will devote the largest amount of time this evening, the issue of the validity of the senses. Why is the issue of sense perception so crucial to epistemology? Because, as you know, man is born tabula rasa. He has no innate ideas. The senses are man's first and primary means of coming into contact with reality, of perceiving that which exists. The senses provide man with the basic evidence which is the foundation of our entire cognitive structure. Everything that we know derives ultimately from the evidence provided by our senses. In particular, all concepts are formed on the basis of sensory evidence. Concepts are forms of organizing, relating, integrating, unifying sense experience. As such, the validity of human concepts, the issue of their relation to reality, depends on the validity of man's sense perceptions. If the senses are invalid, then at one stroke, the whole edifice of human knowledge collapses, and all concepts are immediately invalidated. Now, for a moment, forget all the objections raised against the senses across the centuries. Imagine, if you can, that you were in a rational class on philosophy, and the professor were discussing the issue of the validity of the senses. What would he have to say positively? In other words, apart from answering the countless objections accumulated through the ages. In essence, he would have very little to say. He would say the proposition that man's senses are valid is an expression of the axiom that man is conscious. Why? Well, what is meant by the term valid perception? The answer is, it means a perception of existence, of reality, a perception whose object is an existent, something which is. Notice, I do not say a valid perception is a perception of reality, quote, as it really is. The phrase as it really is in this context is a redundancy. There is no such thing as reality as it really isn't. There is no unreal reality, no non-existent existence. To perceive reality, quote, as it really is simply to perceive reality, the one and only reality there is. Now, what would be the status of an alleged sense perception which was not valid? A perception which was not a perception of existence? Well, it would have to be a perception of non-existence, i.e., of nothing, i.e., it would not be a perception at all, not a form of consciousness or awareness. If invalid perception means, as it does, a perception of something other than existence, it means a state of awareness of nothing, and as such, it is a contradiction in terms. This is true for any perceiving species, whatever its organs and means of perception. If it perceives something that is. In other words, its perceptions are valid. To say that man's senses are invalid is to say that man has no means of awareness of reality. In other words, that he is unconscious. For this reason, the issue of the validity of the senses is contained in the fundamental axiom of consciousness. In stating that man is conscious, one implies man's means of awareness are means of awareness. In other words, his senses are valid. Now, don't be confused here by the phenomenon of dreams or hallucinations. Dreams, hallucinations, and equivalent phenomena are not sense perceptions. They are not examples of man sensorially perceiving something other than existence. Once a man acquires a certain content of experiences from his perception of reality, it is possible for him, under certain circumstances, temporarily to detach his consciousness from the perception of reality and contemplate instead the stored and remembered sensory images in his mind, the content he originally acquired from the perception of reality. In such a case, he is not engaging in sense perception at all. He is turning his consciousness in on itself and contemplating his own stored content of experiences, images, etc. Such a phenomenon is possible only because he has initially acquired this content, acquired it, or at least its ultimate constituents, by direct perception of reality. The phenomenon of dreams, hallucinations, etc. presupposes a prior contact with reality. Such phenomena do not prove that consciousness can sensorially perceive something other than reality. They prove the opposite. Only because man does perceive reality when he senses is he able, under certain circumstances, to acquire the kind of mental contents which then makes it possible for his consciousness temporarily to turn in on itself and contemplate the data thus initially acquired from a direct awareness of reality. For the rest of this evening, therefore, please forget about dreams, hallucinations, and phenomena of that nature. I am talking about sense perception. And sense perception is always perception of existence, of reality, of things which are. Now, against this background, let us turn to the central argument against the senses, the one raised by Protagoras in ancient Greece and accepted in various forms by the overwhelming majority of philosophers ever since. You recall the argument. How can you ever claim to perceive reality by means of your senses, the argument states. After all, you only perceive reality by means of your particular sensory organs, your sensory apparatus. If your sensory organs were different, your perception would be different. All you can say, the argument concludes, is, this is how reality appears to me, granted my particular sensory apparatus. You can never know how things really are in themselves. Now, I would like you to consider this argument, which we have encountered repeatedly in the course. Consider it carefully from the point of view of objectivism. The argument objects to the fact that man can only perceive reality by specific means, his sense organs. Since this is so, the argument claims you can never perceive reality, quote, directly, or never perceive reality in itself, only reality as processed by your sensory apparatus, merely how your consciousness gets reality. Now ask yourself, what is therefore the ideal of this type of argument? What would its exponents regard as an actual perception of reality? What would they call perceiving reality directly? Well, only one thing. If man could jump outside of his own senses, in other words, outside of his means of awareness, outside of his consciousness, and somehow go out to contact things without benefit of sense organs, without having any specific means of perception at all, this, according to the argument, would be a true perception. The perception that this argument yearns for, and in the name of which it condemns human perception, is perception by no means and therefore in no specific form. Perception, know-how. So long as you perceive by any specific means, they write that off as invalid. That, they say, is simply your type of sensory mechanism, your specific type of consciousness. That's merely the form in which a consciousness of your kind perceives. Since man's consciousness is something specific, since it operates by specific organs and agencies, by specific means and in specific forms, it is invalid. That is the meaning of the argument. Now observe that this argument is wider than simply an attack on human consciousness. It is in fact an attack on all consciousness, of any kind whatever. Animal, human, Martian, if such a thing exists, divine, assuming for purposes of pedagogy that it exists. Are an animal's percepts valid by this argument? Any animal now, regardless of the nature or keenness of its sense organs? The thunderous answer is no. After all, the animal still has specific sense organs. It too perceives only reality as it perceives it, reality as it affects its consciousness. What about the Martian? Suppose he has radically different sensory apparatus. He has no eyes, no ears. Imagine he has a bulbous receptacle on his or its forehead, which twitches, and an appendage on its equivalent of a nose which buzzes, so that the Martian perceives reality in terms not of color or of sound, but of some kind of twitches or buzzes. Now, obviously, these are of a kind we do not gain from our senses, and I therefore cannot describe them further to you. But the question is, would this Martian perceive reality according to Protagoras' argument? No. The Martian, the argument would go, perceives reality only as it affects a Martian type of consciousness, only as processed by Martian organs. Even God's consciousness, assuming he exists, and assuming that he perceives somehow, is invalidated by this argument. However God perceives, Protagoras could come back to him and say, you, God, only perceive reality as it appears to God. You only perceive the effects of reality on the divine means of perception. You only perceive reality in a divine form. So again, you don't perceive reality directly, truly, validly. Well, what sort of consciousness then could perceive reality validly, even in theory? And the answer would have to be a consciousness which is not limited to any specific means of perception. a consciousness without any means of consciousness, a consciousness which perceives in no specific form at all, a consciousness which isn't this type of consciousness as distinct from that type, a consciousness which is nothing in particular, in other words, which has no identity. This is the ideal of the Protagorean argument, and this is its standard for epistemology. The only consciousness which could perceive reality is a consciousness without identity, a consciousness which is nothing, in other words, which doesn't exist. The Protagorean argument attacks human consciousness, not in the name of an allegedly superior consciousness, but in the name of a zero, a nothing, an entity without a nature or identity. And as such, the argument invalidates all consciousness, any consciousness, consciousness as such, human or any other kind. Now, it is by this means that philosophers have come to accept the following disastrous idea. If a consciousness has identity, it cannot perceive reality. Or putting it another way, if consciousness is something, it cannot perceive anything. And then, as usual, given this false premises, philosophers proceed to divide into two opposed camps, both accepting the same basic premise. The one side is the skeptics, which later became the Kantians. Later, that is to say, after Hume. They declare consciousness does have an identity. It is something. Therefore, it doesn't perceive reality. The other side, desperate to defend the validity of consciousness, and most of the so-called naive realists are in this side, says, oh yes, consciousness can perceive reality because it has no nature. It is nothing in itself. What is common to both of these theories? The following absurdity. If consciousness is a something, if it has a nature, if it has specific means of perception, perception is impossible. Paraphrasing Ayn Rand, it is having eyes which stand in the way of seeing, having ears which stand in the way of hearing, having specific organs of perception which make perception impossible. Now, by contrast, what is the objectivist position? A is A. Everything which exists is what it is. It has a specific, delimited, definite, finite nature. It is rigidly bound by the laws of identity and causality. And all of this applies not only to facts of the physical world, but also to consciousness. Consciousness, any consciousness, is something. It has a specific nature. Each conscious species perceives by specific means and in a specific form, a form which is determined by its particular means of perception. This is the base from which all epistemology must proceed, and by reference to which all epistemological concepts and standards must be defined. If we are talking about perception, then since consciousness has identity, we must always understand perception to mean perceiving reality by some means and in some form. There is no such thing as perceiving reality no-how, by no means, in no form. For instance, speaking of human perception, we perceive an object, say, by means of light waves reflected from its surface to our eyes. That is the means, and the resultant form is color. We perceive a different aspect of existence by means of certain vibrations striking our ears. That is the means, and the resultant form is sound. We perceive still another aspect of existence by means of bringing certain sensory receptors into contact with the energy states of various molecular combinations. That is the means, and so the form is a heat or cold, etc. In all cases, the object of our perception, what we are perceiving, is a fact out there, a fact of reality. But in all cases, we are perceiving it by a certain means, and so in a certain form. So the contrast between the objectivist view and let's call it the traditionalist view is this. The traditionalist view says if you perceive reality by a certain means, then you are not perceiving reality, only its effects on you. A means of perception is incompatible with perceiving existence. Objectivism says the exact opposite. It says only the existence of a means of perception makes consciousness possible. The fact that consciousness must perceive in a certain form does not invalidate consciousness. That's what makes it possible. The traditionalists say identity is the obstacle to the perception of reality. Objectivism says only because consciousness has identity can it perceive reality. And since this is true, we must always distinguish in any process of knowledge the object, what you know, reality, and the how, the means by which you know it. The object is reality. The how determines only the form of your perception of reality. But all forms of perception are forms of perception, i.e., forms of awareness of reality. As such, all forms of perception are valid. Now you can see the fundamental error of the causal theory of perception, as we have discussed it now many weeks. It is true that reality is the cause of our perceptions, but our perceptions are perceptions of reality. Distinguish here between two statements which may sound similar, but there is a life and death difference between them. The objectivist view is man perceives reality. Notice, he perceives reality by means of its effects on his consciousness. The causal theory of perception says man does not perceive reality, but only its effects on his consciousness. Objectivism says the object is reality, the means, its effects on our sense organs. The causal theory of perception makes the means of perception into the object of perception, thus invalidating man's consciousness, cutting it off from reality. The truth is that we do not perceive effects while being locked up in consciousness. We perceive reality directly, and we do so by means of the operation of our sense organs. So much also, by the way, for the representative theory of perception. Our experience does not, quote, represent or copy or stand for or any synonym of those reality. It is directly of reality. It is not that a separate world is reproduced in consciousness and that we are confined to that world of consciousness, and we then have to engage in arguments about whether it does or doesn't correspond to an external reality that we never perceive. This entire viewpoint is false. Our experience is directly of reality. Now, if you think about it, you will see that the advocates of the causal theory of perception, the representative theory of perception, use stolen concepts all over the place. What is, now think, what is an experience, or a perception, or a sensation, or any equivalent term? These terms designate states of consciousness, not objects of consciousness. A sense perception is a state of awareness, an unanalyzable awareness of reality mediated directly by a sense organ. And equivalent definitions are applicable to a perception, a sensation, etc. Nobody perceives experiences. Let me repeat that. Nobody perceives experiences. You perceive things in reality, and then we give the name perception to our awareness of these things. To speak of perceiving perceptions or experiencing experiences is to speak of being aware of your awareness, which immediately raises the question, your awareness of what? Consciousness requires an object. We do not sit locked up in our consciousness, perceiving its perceptions, of its perceptions, of its perceptions, and so on to infinity, with nothing there being perceived. we perceive reality. Of course, we can be self-conscious. We can be aware that we are aware that we are perceiving. But for this to be possible, we must first be aware of something, of an object, of an existent. All right, now let us turn to a series of questions and objections raised by philosophers owing to the fact that not all consciousnesses perceive reality in the same sensory forms. Now, this much is true. Animals, for instance, have to a certain extent different capacities of sense perception from men. There are variations in the structure of human sense organs. And if you want to, for pedagogical purposes, go ahead and project a race of Martians who perceive reality in the form of the twitches and buzzes I mentioned earlier. In other words, let us grant the fact that there are many different forms of sense perception possible depending upon the different types of consciousness that exist. Now, many philosophers think that this poses a grave objection to the senses. What objection? Well, the commonest one is this. They say if two different consciousnesses perceive the same object in different forms, owing to their different means of perception, doesn't this lead to a contradiction? To take the standard example, a man with normal vision looks at a given object and says, it's red. The colorblind man looks and says, it's gray. And then the question goes, isn't this a contradiction? It can't be both red and non-red, can it? So somebody's sense experience must be wrong. Now, the answer to this objection is no contradictions between any form of perception and any other are logically possible. When a person says this object is red, what is he validly entitled to mean by the statement? Bearing in mind everything I've said up to now. Well, he must recognize that he is perceiving the object in a specific form, determined by his specific means of perception. He cannot evade the issue of means and pretend he has some kind of mystic revelation from the object, and that the nature of his specific means of perception is irrelevant. What then can he validly mean by the statement, it is red? The answer is the following. It is an entity in reality of a specific nature, such that when it acts upon my senses, I perceive it in the form of red color. And this is true. That is what it is. Now the colorblind man says, it is gray. What can he validly mean by the statement? It is an entity in reality of a specific nature, such that when it acts upon my senses, I perceive it in the form of gray color. And that is true. That is what it is. Both are true statements. Neither conflicts with or contradicts the other. And if the Martian comes in and says it is twitchy, the same applies to him. It is an entity in reality of a specific nature such that when it acts on his senses, he perceives it in the form of twitchiness. In sum, each man and Martian must recognize that his perceptions are perceptions of reality. They are not whims. They are not subjective inventions or distortions. A man has no choice regarding the nature of his perceptions. Each of his perceptions is an inexorably determined effect caused by an object in reality acting on his particular organs of perception. If each perceiver properly defines what he is entitled to claim about the object, there is no contradiction at all. Where is the appearance of a contradiction? Only if one of them thinks, I have a mystical contact with reality. I perceive without benefit of sense organs. I just, so to speak, wrap my consciousness around the object and see it, quote, really. Everyone else is seeing it invalidly. Only this attitude is what causes the trouble. But this represents a crucial error. Now another question, deriving from the fact of differences of sensory forms. If consciousnesses can perceive in different forms, and they derive all of their conceptual conclusions about reality from their sense experiences, Doesn't this mean that the various consciousnesses will come to different conceptual conclusions about the nature of reality? The answer to the question is no. Differences of sensory form do not matter and have no epistemological importance at all. The conceptual conclusions you will come to about reality will be identical, whether you are human or Martian, possessed of normal vision or colorblind, or you name it. Take the normal human being. We perceive reality in terms of color, tactile sensations, and so on. We have these sense data. Now, what do we do with them cognitively? They are the material of knowledge, but they are not yet conceptual knowledge. What do we do with our sensory data to build the structure of human knowledge? Now, as you know from Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, we observe similarities and differences in our perceptual material. Similarities and differences. And we proceed then to abstract, omit measurements, integrate, form concepts, in other words, rise to the conceptual level, and then proceed conceptually to discover the laws of reality, formulate our scientific theories, and so on. What is the function of the senses in this process? Twofold. One, to give us the basic evidence of existence, of what is. And two, more specifically, to give us the evidence of similarities and differences among existence, which evidence is then the basis permitting us to rise to the conceptual level. Now ask yourself, what difference does it make in what form you perceive the initial data from reality, the initial similarities and differences, and thus are enabled to develop to the next cognitive stage? So long as your perceptual form permits you to develop a knowledge of similarities and differences, and every perceptual form does this, the rest is the work of the mind, of the conceptual faculty, not of the senses, and differences of sensory form are simply irrelevant. Now, the simplest case on which to see this is the case of the so-called red-green inversion. You know, this is a question that's sometimes asked. How do you know that whenever you perceive what you call red, the man next to you, perceiving the same object, doesn't have the experience that you have, but has the experience of green, of what you would call green, and vice versa? So your red and green perceptions are inverted or reversed. Well, apart from the fact that this is a baseless fancy, assume for the moment it were true. So what? He still classifies objects precisely as you do. He puts all objects of a certain group together as similar in color, the very ones that you put together. He contrasts this group with the other, and so do you. You both classify and conceptualize in exactly the same way. So what difference does it make that that you grasp these two groups initially in different sensory forms? It makes no difference. In fact, it wouldn't even come up. You'd never even learn about such a difference if it existed, because all of your conceptual activities would be the same as his in regard to these objects. You'd call them by the same word, since words are ultimately defined ostensibly simply by pointing, and the whole construct in sum means nothing at all. The same principle is true of the Martian with his twitches and buzzes. Whatever similarities he perceives in his twitchy, buzzy form are there. They are real. And his concepts therefore reflect objective facts of reality, just as yours do. Only what you hold in the form of color, he holds in the form of twitches. What wider significance does this have? None. In this respect, and as an analogy only, you can compare the sense perceptions to a language. A language is a unified system of signs by which you hold all your concepts. And every language is capable in principle of saying whatever there is to be said. There is no contradiction between French and English, for instance. Both languages refer to the same reality, the same facts. Both are equally valid. The difference is only in the form of the signs. Well, in an analogous way, and this is just an analogy, You can think of sensory form as a language. You can think of your perceptions of reality as written in, held by you in a specific sensory form, a specific code by which you hold and have your perceptions of existence. Of course, in contrast to language, this is not a man-made code. It is completely determined by the facts of reality and the nature of your consciousness, its means of perception. There is no choice in this case, as there is in the case of which language you will speak. But the relevant point is the fact that there can be many such sensory codes possessed by different species is as irrelevant as in the case of language, where there are many, because all of them are just so many sensory codes to enable the perceiver to grasp the same ultimate facts of reality. For this reason, all perceivers will agree about the nature of reality. None will contradict the others. In actual fact, there are only two differences between the various sensory forms that do or theoretically might exist. One, how much information is given directly by the senses of a particular species. And two, what particular information is given directly. In other words, some sensory forms are superior, not in terms of validity, all are equally valid, but in terms of the quantity of evidence they give the perceiver directly. And some can vary in terms of what type of information they give. Let us consider each of these cases briefly. And first, the case of senses giving different amounts of information. Take the case of a totally colorblind man who will not be able directly to discriminate differences that we can by simple perception. Suppose he perceives everything as the same shade of gray. He therefore gets less direct information about the differences in reality than we do. Does it follow that he then has his own physics? No. He must then learn by inference from what he does perceive directly that there are facts here outside of his range of direct perception. And of course, the study of the phenomenon of light will give him ample evidence of such facts. At the end of his cognitive quest, he will end up with the same physics as the normally sighted person. Just as, for instance, we have come to learn of infrared and ultraviolet ranges of the spectrum by inference from what we do perceive, even though this information is not given to us directly. Or just as we are able to discover frequencies of sound outside the human range of hearing, frequencies that dogs, for instance, can hear. Now consider the second point of difference. If you want an example of a completely different kind of information given by a sensory apparatus, let's be bizarre for a moment. Imagine a species of atoms with consciousness. And of course, given the scale of size of an atom, let us say that they perceive the atomic structure of things directly. So for them, the fact that matter is atomic is not a theory to be reached by inference, as in our case. They actually perceive only whirling clouds of particles. Now, you might be tempted to say, oh, well, then their form of perception is more valid than ours. They see things really. But that would be wholly false. By the very fact that their consciousness, as we are hypothesizing, operates on a submicroscopic range of perception, by that very fact, they do not gain from the senses the kind of information we get directly. We get information, real information about reality directly that they don't. We have to infer submicroscopic objects. They have to infer macroscopic objects, like this table or the Empire State Building. They can't take in directly, given the scale of their senses, large-scale physical objects. So it takes a genius among their species to reason to the conclusion that there must be special forces in reality binding these whirling particles together into objects too large to be grasped directly. In effect, the genius in their species is required to reach the conclusions available to the morons in ours, and vice versa. No form of perception can perceive everything directly. Why? Because A is A. Any sensory apparatus is finite, it is limited. By virtue of being able to perceive one aspect of reality with one type of sensory apparatus, you cannot then expect to perceive directly some other aspect if it would depend upon a different scope or kind of sensory apparatus. Now I conclude, therefore, that all forms of sense perception, all, are valid, that no contradictions are possible among them, that all perceivers, regardless of differences in form, regardless of what particular information they get directly from perception and what they must reach by inference, will, if they're rational, end with the same conceptual account of the nature and laws of reality. What is the objectivist view of the nature of mind? Is it a faculty, an entity, or a process? Would you accept the following one-sentence answer? Because that's all I'll give you. It is a faculty possessed by an entity, the human being, whose essence is to perform a process. Namely, the process of consciousness, which is a state of action, of sensing, integrating, conceptualizing, etc. So, from different aspects, it is all of these. Is there any difference between the statement, this is X's apparent shape, and this is X's shape as it appears to me? Yes, I could understand, I could grasp a difference between those two. I suppose you are looking at something from a great distance, and your viewpoint is obscured, and you say, it appears to me that the man in the distance has the shape of a very large stomach, but I can't see that clearly at this distance, and I'm not sure. So his apparent shape is an obese rotundity, let us say, but I can't be sure. On the other hand, you come right up to him, and you see him, and you're standing right there, and you investigate, and you say, Mr. X's shape, as I perceive it, as it appears to me, is, let us say, definitely circular. If it is, then there's no doubt. In other words, the word apparent there could be used to express doubt about the actual nature of what you're perceiving. I trust that my lecture does not require me now to repeat that when you say this is the shape as I perceive it, or as it appears to me, you do not draw subjectivist conclusions from that, but I won't repeat that whole thing over again. If differences in forms of perception are attributed to different quantities of information available to the perceiver, isn't your assertion that all perceptions are equally valid contradicted? Now let me get this one. I said that there can be differences in form of perception, and that one form can be differences in the amount of information. How does that contradict my statement that all perceptions are equally valid? The fact that you are not given everything does not mean that what you are given is invalid. There is no relationship between quantity and validity. If your senses give you, let us just pick an arbitrary figure out of the air, 5,000 facts. Don't ask me how I arrived at that. And somebody else's senses give them 10,000 facts. On what ground would you say your 5,000 facts are no good because you have less facts than he does? A fact is a fact. Validity is a question of the relation of your cognitive mechanism to reality. The most you can say is if the normally sighted person is against the one who perceives no color gradations or color changes gets more information, just as the person who has 20/20 vision gets more information than the one whose eyes give him much less information without the correction of eyeglasses. In that sense, as I tried to say in the lecture, one form of sense perception can be superior to another, but that is simply a matter of how much is given you directly and how much do you have to reach by inference. It is not a matter of the validity. In what context and with reference to what actions or attributes of specifically human entities can the term subjective be validly used? Well, not to give you a whole detailed analysis of the term subjective. The term subjective can be validly used to designate a type of error, a type of departure from reality on the part of a conceptual consciousness. To begin with, the term subjective cannot, for all the reasons I mentioned in the lecture, be applied on the perceptual level. Nothing on the perceptual level can be subjective. Everything on the perceptual level is the product of an inexorable physical interaction between the object and the sense organ. The concept subjective is applicable only on the conceptual level, and only because man has free will. His consciousness is not automatically infallible. It is therefore possible for him to use his consciousness on the conceptual level in a way which departs from the facts of reality. Now, I don't mean here simply an error. If a person is rational, they go by the evidence, but they make an honest error. That person is not subjective. He is simply mistaken. In exactly the same way that a person can be completely honest in a moral issue and yet mistaken. So he is wrong, but not immoral. Subjective as an epistemological term is not synonymous with simply mistaken. It means a mistaken content which comes from a method which represents a departure from reality at its root. For instance, a man says to you, I believe the earth is flat. You know, the flat earth society that I think there are still remnants of somewhere in Britain. And you ask him why, and he says, I feel it. I feel it very strongly. And that's it. Now you can say that belief is subjective. And that man is being subjective. Meaning, he is placing the subject above the object. And meaning by that, he is treating his consciousness as an entity which dictates to reality. So his arbitrary feelings create the corresponding facts. That is true subjectivism. The subjective is the view of the primacy of consciousness applied to human beings, that human feelings can shape or mold facts. And in that sense, the term subjective can validly be used to designate a type of departure from reality. It cannot, however, validly be used to designate any fact of reality. Notice that even the phenomenon of consciousness itself, the phenomenon, is not subjective. Man's faculty of consciousness exists. That is a fact. It doesn't exist because we want it to exist or don't want it to exist. It exists. That is a fact. And in that sense, it is an objective fact in the same way that any fact is objective.